The manuscript lay open on Reverend Robert Kirk's desk that May evening in 1692. 7 years documenting the secret commonwealth, his systematic catalogue of fairy society was complete. Local whispers had grown urgent. Old women crossing themselves when they saw him. Children avoiding Doon Hill. His congregation was nervous when he mentioned supernatural matters. Kirk climbed the fairy knoll one final time, manuscript beneath his arm. He'd spent countless nights mapping territorial boundaries of beings that shouldn't exist, recording supernatural abilities with scholarly precision. The villagers found his body at dawn, sprawled lifeless at the summit. This was no natural death, they whispered. The fairies had claimed him. Punishment for exposing their secrets. At his funeral, mourners glimpsed a tall figure in clerical dress among the trees, watching with eyes that held too much knowledge for mortal souls. When his manuscript finally reached print, readers discovered what cost Kirk his life. These weren't diminutive garden sprites, but beings of immense power commanding societies that surpassed human civilization. Shapeshifters bending reality itself. Time manipulators compressing centuries into heartbeats. Across Celtic lands, from Newgrange to Skye, from Tara to Glastonbury, certain places pulse with otherworldly energy, where dimensional membranes grow thin. For 2 millennia, humans have encountered these entities, leaving testimony revealing unsettling truths. Gerald of Wales documented history's most detailed fairy encounter while travelling through Pembrokeshire. A local priest shared the account of Elidurus, a boy who discovered an underground kingdom beneath the river Neath. It was said through a dark tunnel, Elidurus entered a twilight realm, inhabited by small, fair-haired people in golden garments riding tiny horses. They sustained themselves on saffron-flavoured milk. Their king questioning him about the upper world's fascination for human violence. Concepts foreign to their harmonious civilization. They permitted free travel between realms, but prohibited removing anything from their kingdom. For months, Eladurus witnessed their advanced society, marveling at technology that transcended medieval understanding. Their governance operated on principles, making human civilization seem brutish by comparison. The fatal mistake came when his mother convinced him to bring back a golden ball as proof. The moment he surfaced with it, the sphere vanished, and the tunnel sealed forever. And despite years of searching, he never found the fairy kingdom ever again. Gerald's meticulous documentation reveals fairy characteristics persisting across centuries. Twilight realms existing parallel to our own. Absolute prohibitions against theft. Conditional access dependent on fairy goodwill. And sophisticated civilization operating by utterly alien principles. This wasn't primitive folklore, but systematic investigation of impossible phenomena anchored in specific geographic locations. The witness testimony format and careful scholarly documentation make this one of the earliest credible fairy investigations, establishing patterns that would repeat for centuries. Now, before Christianity transformed Celtic spirituality, the Tuatha De Danann, the divine tribe of goddess Danu, ruled Ireland from otherworld strongholds. Archaeological evidence from Newgrange, Tara, and the entire Brú na Bóithre complex suggests these beings transcended mythological constructs, their astronomical alignments capturing and focusing celestial energies through passages framing otherworld gateways. Their four great treasures demonstrated reality-shaping technology beyond human comprehension. Dagda's cauldron provided endless sustenance and resurrection powers, restoring warriors to life for renewed battle. Lu's spear never missed targets and compelled absolute truth from those it threatened. Nuada's sword cut through any defense while binding wielders to complete honesty. The Leah Foyle Stone of Destiny, still standing at Tara, screamed when touched by rightful kings, its otherworldly shriek audible across counties. Individual Tuatha De Danann possessed abilities dwarfing human understanding. Breed commanded forge fire and divine inspiration, maintaining eternal flames at Kildare that consumed no fuel. The Morrigan manifested as a beautiful woman or a crow, her battlefield prophecies determining outcomes before combat began. Manannán MacLear ruled the seas with mist boats faster than wind, the phantom islands appearing and vanishing according to will. Classical observers documented these encounters with appropriate awe. When Roman legions attacked Anglicie's Druidic stronghold in 16 CE, Tacitus recorded terrifying moments when Druids summoned shining protectors, luminous figures emerging from sacred groves to stand between the Holy Island and its invaders. These weren't folklore fantasies, but systematic supernatural warfare, employing otherworld allies whose power could devastate entire armies. As Christianity spread across Celtic territories, ancient gods adapted by establishing parallel realms operating alongside human civilization. This created elaborate court systems, defining fairy society. Sophisticated civilizations choosing shadow governance over direct rule. Their invisible kingdoms existing in spaces between dimensions. The Seelie Court emerged as blessed ones, generally benevolent entities honoring ancient contracts with humanity. They were tall, elegant, radiating inner light that could blind mortal eyes. Seelie fairies blessed crops when properly approached, protected respectful travelers, and granted wishes to those demonstrating genuine need rather than mere greed. Said they dressed in fabric shifting color like oil on water, rode horses leaving no hoofprints, and spoke in voices bypassing ears to resonate directly in listeners' minds. Operating from Highland strongholds, it was said the Seelie maintained neutral territories where humans could safely approach their representatives. Skye's Ferry Bridge marked diplomatic ground for supernatural negotiations. Glencoe's hidden valleys sheltered their councils from human interference. Dunvegan Castle hosted meetings between fairy nobles and sympathetic clan leaders, with Highland families preserving detailed records of supernatural military aid, magical gifts influencing clan fortunes, and protective enchantments spanning generations. The Unseelie court represented darker aspects of otherworld power. Unblessed ones found entertainment in human suffering, viewing mortal anguish as fascinating spectacles worthy of careful study. Possessing identical reality-shaping abilities as their Seelie cousins, they employed supernatural power for cruelty rather than protection, their malevolence limited only by imagination and opportunity. Unseelie fairies maintained their beauty, but carried wrongness that careful observers could detect. Skin too pale for human genetics, eyes completely black without visible pupils, smiles revealing too many teeth, or unsettling stillness suggesting they weren't quite alive in any recognizable sense. They delighted in cursing those who offended them, bringing disease to entire communities, manipulating human minds until victims descended into madness, stealing souls to power their supernatural abilities. Their most terrifying manifestation was the wild hunt. Ghostly riders, led by Unseelie kings pursuing human souls across night skies. Those hearing hunting horns and baying hounds knew death approached, for the hunt collected the dying and dragged them to the otherworld realms for purposes too dark to contemplate. Both courts maintained hierarchies transcending human political limitation. Fairy queens, it was said, ruled with absolute authority. Their reality-shaping powers making them virtually omnipotent within territorial domains. Fairy kings, it was said, commanded military forces, guarding boundaries with ruthless efficiency. Below them ranged nobles with specialized abilities: weather control, time manipulation, inter-realm ambassadorships. Political centers included Knockma and Galway, where it was said elaborate processions emerged from hillsides during the new moons, and the Isle of Man's Tinwald Hill, hosting fairy parliaments paralleling human governance with supernatural legislation affecting fishing rights and crop yields. As fairy society consolidated across Celtic territories, environmental specialization created distinct supernatural species adapted to specific landscapes and human communities. These represent fundamentally different otherworld entities, each commanding unique abilities reflecting their chosen domains. Ireland's banshees embodied terrifying prophetic power, supernaturally bonded to ancient bloodlines through prehistoric pacts transcending memory. These spirits possessed death sight piercing time's veil, their otherworldly vision revealing approaching tragedy with merciless clarity. The banshee's shrieks could carry across impossible distances to warn family members of doom approaching on silent feet. Manifestations followed specific patterns, suggesting deeper supernatural mechanics. Beautiful women lured the unwary into complacency before delivering prophetic messages. Ancient hags abandoned all pretense of comfort for stark truth-telling. Most disturbing were washing women, figures discovered at midnight streams, scrubbing blood-stained clothing belonging to the soon-to-die. Kerry and Cork families preserved meticulous documentation of hereditary banshee attachments, noting specific manifestation signs and tracking uncanny accuracy of supernatural warnings. Scotland's brownies developed the most successful fairy-human partnerships. These household spirits possessed supernatural strength, enabling impossible overnight accomplishments, moving massive stones, challenging modern machinery, harvesting entire fields while households slept, constructing buildings with inhumane speed and precision. Their appearance combined human and animal characteristics: pointed ears, elongated limbs, faces blending human intelligence with bestial features. Brownie loyalty, once earned, proved absolutely unshakable. They would protect adopted households across generations, providing supernatural aid in warfare, early warning of dangers, and protective magic shielding entire clans from harm. Highland castles throughout the Cairngorms preserved brownie chambers, small rooms featuring stone beds, and tiny fireplaces burning without consuming fuel. But their rules brooked no violation. Offering clothing or wages drove them away forever, as would spying on any nocturnal activities. Scotland's coastal waters harboured Selkies, dual-natured beings whose seal forms could transform into human shapes through magical sealskins, functioning as both garment and gateway between worlds. They wielded profound sea magic, predicting storms with perfect accuracy, navigating by stars invisible to human eyes, communicating with marine life across vast oceanic distances. Orkney and Shetland fishing families preserved numerous Selkie marriage accounts, supernatural unions, producing children with inherited abilities, marking them as partially otherworldly. These half-Selkie offspring displayed second sight, uncanny swimming skills verging on supernatural, and weather prediction capabilities invaluable to maritime communities. Yet, Selkie relationships carried inherent tragedies. Stolen skins trapped them in human form, but recovering magical hides meant immediate return to the sea. Wales developed unique fairy ecosystems centered on Tylwyth Teg, fair folk ruling mountain and valley domains. Lake maidens dwelling in Snowdonia's glacial tarns possess beauty transcending human understanding, their enchantments driving mortal men to madness with single glances. Most remarkable were the Coblin Eye, Welsh mine spirits, representing fairy adaptation to industrial environments. As humans delve deeper to mountain stone, these beings established tunnel territorial claims, appearing as small miner-like figures, possessing supernatural ore detection abilities, underground maze navigation skills, and cave-in warning systems. The Scottish witch trials produced countless supernatural testimonies, but none were as detailed as Bessie Dunlop's account from Dalry in Ayrshire. Unlike other accursed witches confessing diabolical pacts, Bessie maintained innocence while describing extraordinary fairy relationships, challenging contemporary understanding. Meeting Tom Reed while driving cattle to pasture, she initially perceived him as an honest, wheel elderly man and grey-bearded, wearing respectable clothing marking gentleman status. Only gradually did impossibility become apparent. Tom revealed his death at Pinkie Battle 30 years earlier, and his current residence with the fairy folk in Elfland's court. Serving as a supernatural teacher, Tom Reed instructed Bessie in arts no mortal possessed. He taught medicinal herb identification by hidden properties, revealing plants curing diseases baffling professional physicians. His knowledge extended beyond herbalism to stolen goods locations, thief identification, and prophetic visions, invariably proving accurate. But most remarkably, Tom Reed brought other fairy folk to visit Bessie's home. She described elaborate processions materializing in her cottage. Magnificent riders in color-shifting clothing, mounted on white horses, led by Elfland's queen herself. These beings radiated otherworldly beauty and power, their presence transforming humble dwellings to fairy palace approximations. Through these visitations, Bessie learned sophisticated fairy society structure. Elfland's queen ruled absolutely over noble fairy courts, whose beauty and abilities far exceeded human limitations. They inhabited magnificent subterranean halls, traveled instantly between realms, and commanded reality reshaping magic. These weren't diminutive folklore creatures, but full-sized beings, rivaling angelic power. Tragically, Bessie's honesty about fairy connections ensured her execution. Courts could accept supernatural power from demonic alliance, but not possibilities of benevolent fairy teachers. Her detailed testimony preserves complete records of fairy-human relationships, demonstrating fairy interest in human welfare, sophisticated teaching methods, elaborate social organizations, and willingness to share knowledge with worthy mortals. The fairies' powers reach far beyond the tricks and charms of mortal magicians. Their abilities touch the roots of the world itself, shaping what is seen, what is felt, and even the passage of time. Those who have crossed into their realms or met them on wild hills tell of wonders that cannot be explained by any craft of humankind. Foremost is the art known among the old storytellers as the veiling. This is no simple illusion. It changes the very substance of the world for as long as the fairy wills it. A tumble-down hut can stand as a great hall. A patch of heather can be made into a banquet table, heavy with gold and silver. To those caught within it, the enchantment feels true to every sense. The gleam of metal, the scent of roast meats, the warmth of a fire. Yet, when the spell breaks, the gold is leaves, the feast is dust, the fire is cold stone. Fairies can take hold of a mortal's thoughts as easily as a shepherd might catch a lamb. They may cloud a mind so that the entire meeting is forgotten, or plant false memories so firmly that they are believed for a lifetime. More subtle still is the music of their halls. Tunes so sweet and strange that those who hear them will dance without rest, unable to stop until their strength is gone. Many who enter their company find that time itself flows differently. A single night in the fairylands might span 100 years in the world of men, while long seasons spent in their halls can pass as only an hour outside. There are places, New Grange at the winter solstice, the stones of Callanish, where time does seem to buckle, and those who visit speak of journeys that end hours before they began. Fairy mounds are said to hold more within than the size of the hill could ever contain. Endless halls, forests, and seas under the earth. It is said travelers have walked for miles beneath a single rise, passing into lands that no map could show. It is said they can heal any wound in a heartbeat, or strike a healthy man with an illness no doctor could ever cure. Some bestow gifts of long life or youth, while others can wither a mortal to nothing in a matter of days. The darkest of these powers is the stealing of the soul, leaving behind a perfect likeness that is no more than a shell. Such changelings may speak and move like the person they replace, but they are hollow, their true spirit taken to the other world. Generations of encounters, some fortunate, others fatal, have taught that the fair folk abide by laws as old as stone. These laws are not human, yet they bind fairies and mortals alike, and breaking them invites swift and often merciless punishment. Those who keep to them, however, may earn protection, favor, and bonds lasting through entire family lines. Foremost is the law of exact exchange. Every kindness must be answered in kind, every gift repaid in full, every promise kept to the letter. These bindings are more than oaths. They are woven to the very fabric of the other world, impossible to break without dreadful cost. Yet the fair folk take words at their plainest meaning. There is no room for implication or excuse. Old Scottish trial records speak of these laws with fearful clarity. Never refuse food or drink offered by a fairy. It is the highest insult. Yet to eat it binds you to their realm. Speak always with courtesy, for they take offense at the slightest slight. Never spy upon their gatherings. The fate of Reverend Kirk is warning enough. And if you make a bargain, keep it to the very word. Over centuries, mortals have found ways to guard themselves. Cold iron burns them. Salt cast in a perfect circle holds them out. Running water bars their path, and the toll of a church bell drives them away. Rowan wood, sacred and protective, is said to ward their touch. But every gift from them hides a shadow. Gold turns to leaves at sunrise. Food makes mortal bread forever taste like ash. A fairy lover's kiss can steal the years from your life. And the music of their halls can make you dance until your heart fails. To see through their enchantments is the most dangerous gift of all. It may keep you from their lies, but it may also drive you to madness. Human minds were not made to bear the sight of the world as they see it. In times of peril, carry iron in your pocket, sword at your feet, sprig of rowan in your hand. Seek running water in the first light of dawn. These remain even now the surest known protections. In the Victorian age, the great powers of the fair folk were shrunken in the public mind until they were thought no more than tiny winged ornaments for children's tales. Where once they had been tall as kings and fierce as gods, they became imagined as flower-sized sprites with only enough magic to tend a garden. This was no accident. The New Age preferred its wonders tame. The vast and dangerous forces of the old stories had no place in cities of steel and smoke. So, the image of the fairy was reshaped to fit parlors and nurseries. The realms once spanning mountains and seas were confined to hedgerows and meadows. Their power, once feared, was made safe for picture books. Yet in the quiet places, the truth endured. Lone hawthorn trees, bound by ancient taboos, still stood untouched by axe or plough. Stone circles still hummed with unseen forces, defying the compass and confounding the clock. Sacred wells still gave water that healed without cause. In the Gaelic-speaking hills and islands, the old ways were never wholly lost. Families kept the gift of second sight. Wise women treated illness with cures taught by otherworldly hands. Cunning folk in Wales whispered charms learned from lake maidens. Fishermen in the Isle of Man still steered by the warnings of unseen allies. Even the modern traveller at a stone circle or fairy hill sometimes feels time slip strangely, or finds their mechanical devices fail without reason. The storyteller Eddie Linehan has gathered many such accounts, where roadways and plans are changed rather than disturb a lone fairy tree. In this, the fair folk did not vanish. They simply learned to wear a smaller mask. While polite society in London imagined only harmless garden sprites, the people of rural Ireland knew that the fair folk had not grown any less dangerous. In a village in County Tipperary, belief in their powers led to one of the most chilling cases ever recorded. Bridget Cleary was young, skilled, and independent. A dressmaker whose talent and spirit set her apart. When she fell ill one March, it began as a fever and weakness. Yet soon, strange changes were noticed. Her voice carried unfamiliar turns of phrase. Her movements and expressions were subtly wrong, as though the woman they loved was wearing another's skin. A local fairy doctor, Dennis Ganny, confirmed the family's fear. Bridget was gone. In her place stood a changeling, perfect in form yet lacking the spark that made her truly herself. The family turned to the old remedies. They brewed bitter foxglove tea, held her over the kitchen fire, and demanded that she speak the words no changeling could ever say. I am Bridget Cleary, wife of Michael Cleary. When Michael became convinced she was not his wife, he acted according to grim tradition, burning the impostor so that the true Bridget might be freed to return from the hill. Neighbors, family, even the doctor took part. Bridget's body was buried, and in the days that followed, Michael claimed he waited for her to ride home on a white horse, bound by fairy straps. The courts called it murder. Many locals, though, called it justice. You see, to them, the dead woman was not Bridget at all, but a shadow sent in her place. A reminder that the changeling's art is to make a perfect double that is, in truth, empty. collectors of Victorian folklore uncovered a hidden order behind the chaos of fairy stories. A structure of rule and rank that rivals the grandest human kingdoms. These otherworld realms were not leaderless gatherings of wandering sprites, but nations within their own monarchs, laws, and appointed servants, holding their thrones through centuries of human upheaval. The queens of the fair folk are spoken as forces of nature given form. They can bend the laws of the world within their domains, bring life or death with a thought, halt the march of years or speed it, and command the hearts of mortals until they are driven to madness. At Glastonbury Tor and other ancient sites, they are described as so beautiful that the sight of them alone is perilous. Their voices felt in the bones, rather than heard with the ear. The kings are the guardians of the boundaries, masters of war and protection. They ride at the head of armies that no human blade can touch, moving with speed no mortal can match. Highland clans speak of battles turned by their intervention, of foes scattered before their unseen ranks. Beneath the monarchs are those that keep the realm in order. Court musicians whose playing can raise joy or grief in a heartbeat. Guards whose weapons strike with both steel and spell. Messengers who can carry thought itself across leagues in an instant. Even the running of a palace falls under fairy care. Servants who conjure feasts from scraps, keep halls spotless without lifting a hand, and weave garments that shift in color like clouds in the wind. Justice here is swift and without measure. Small offense might earn a curse lasting generations. Entire bloodlines may be punished for one ancestor's slight. Punishments often mirror the crime, poetic but never merciful, and appeals can demand more than the original wrong was worth. The march of electricity and iron rails has not swept the fair folk away completely. If anything, it has given new ways to glimpse them, new signs of their passing. The places where they walk are the same as they have always been. Hills, circles, wells. But the traces they leave are now seen in faltering screens, broken signals, and clocks that tell the wrong hour. Walkers on the winter solstice at Newgrange still speak of hours unaccounted for. Some return from the stones of Callanish earlier than they left, others much later, with no sense of time passing at all. Cameras aimed at fairy places fail or return strange patterns. Mobile phones give directions to places that do not exist. The old blessings endure as well. Waters from certain wells and springs still heal sickness that medicine cannot touch. Tests show nothing in them that could explain it, yet the cures persist. Some who share bloodlines rooted deep in Celtic soil seem to meet with the other world more often than chance would follow, as though the gift or the curse runs in the veins. And in the matters of the earth, the fair folk have found strange allies. Campaigners to protect wild places sometimes find their work made easier by sudden failures of machines, delays to projects, or changes in plans to avoid cutting an ancient tree. In Ireland, roads still bend to leave certain hawthorns standing untouched, just as they did 100 years ago. From all that has been told, one truth emerges. The fair folk are not of our world, but of a realm that touches it only at certain places and times. At these crossings, the rules of nature falter, and their will becomes law. They can weave a place apart from the rest of the world, where gold gleams and food never spoils until the moment the spell breaks. They can reach into the heart and mind of a mortal, filling it with joy, dread, or false memories that feel more real than truth. They change as we change, shifting their shape to fit the age. Gods in one century, household spirits in the next. Pretty winged creatures and painted books, and now presences that unsettle the electronic world. Yet whatever form they wear, their essence is constant, their strength undimmed. Their dealings with humankind are not without purpose. They have taught the growing of crops, the finding of herbs, the signs of the sky. In return, they have kept their influence over the land and its people. Wherever the children of the Celts have gone, members of the fair folk. Whether they followed their people across the seas, or whether the sight for them simply wakes in certain blood under the right skies, no one can say. To meet them now is to glimpse something older than cities, older than nations. A reminder that there is more to this earth than the maps can show. In these times, the old rules of caution still stand. The signs of their presence may be different, but the danger is the same. If the air grows suddenly cold in a place where no wind blows, if your camera fails without reason, if your phone guides you to nowhere or tells you the date is centuries past, tread carefully, my friend. If the forest grows silent, or your dog refuses to go on, you may be standing on their ground. Perfect rings in grass or flowers, whether of mushrooms or bare earth, are not to be crossed without leave. If you must greet them, do so with respect. A bow of the head, a kind word. Milk, honey, or bread are still proper gifts. Do not wear iron if you wish to be welcome. If trouble comes, fall back on the oldest defenses. Carry a piece of iron in your pocket. Pour a circle of salt if you have the time. Cross running water if you can. Keep a sprig of rowan with you. And remember that dawn is your greatest ally, for with the first light, their strength fades. Across the centuries, through changes in language, in faith, the very shape of the lands, the fair folk have endured. They still shift their forms, twist time, and make or unmake the world before our eyes. Their courts and laws have outlasted kings, empires, and the boundaries of nations. The places where they have always been, Newgrange, Tara, Callanish, Glastonbury, still hum with the same strange life they held when Druids called them to battle. In our age, they trouble our machines, as once they troubled our plows. Their power is unchanged. They may seem smaller now than they were in the time of the gods, yet truth runs deeper. The old dangers are only sleeping, hidden beneath a veil of stories fit for children. They guard their places as fiercely as ever. They keep their bargains they make, for good or for ill. And wherever the mists gathered over sacred hills, wherever the dark pools lie in shadow under the trees, they are still there, watching, waiting, and utterly real. For centuries, Highland clans documented family members who possessed what they call the two sights. These weren't vague predictions or general feelings. These were specific prophecies, names, dates, exact circumstances of deaths and disasters, all seen before they happened. Clan chiefs consulted seers before going into battle. The Presbyterian Church tried to stamp it out as witchcraft. Scientists dismissed it as superstition. Yet the documentation remains. Parish records, family papers, dated prophecies that came true with eerie precision. Tonight, as you settle into comfort, we'll examine the evidence together and explore what might explain this uniquely Highland phenomenon. Now, Kenneth Mackenzie, known in Gaelic as Cognac O'Dor, which means the dun-coloured Kenneth, lived in the Scottish Highlands during the 1600s. He worked on the Bran estate, serving the Mackenzie chiefs of Seaforth. Unlike many seers who kept their visions private, Kenneth made hundreds of prophecies, many of which were carefully recorded by those who heard them. His life ended tragically. Lady Seaforth, whose husband was away in Paris, demanded that Kenneth use his sight to tell her what her husband was doing. Kenneth saw the chief in the arms of another woman. When he reluctantly revealed this, Lady Seaforth had him executed for witchcraft. But before he died, Kenneth made one final prophecy about the Seaforth line, one that would take over a century to unfold. Now, let's look at the three most remarkable predictions he made. The first concerns the Caledonian Canal. In the 1650s, Kenneth said, "Full-rigged ships will be seen sailing eastward and westward by the back of the Tomnahurach." At the time, this made no sense whatsoever. The Tomnahurach was a landlocked hill near Inverness. There was no water anywhere near it, and certainly no way for sailing ships to pass by. Yet, 170 years later, between 1803 and 1822, the Caledonian Canal was built, connecting the North Sea to the Atlantic Ocean through the Great Glen. The canal passes right by the Tomnahurach, exactly where Kenneth said ships would sail parish records from before 1660 document this prophecy, decades before anyone had even conceived of building such a canal. The idea wouldn't emerge until the 1790s. So how did a Highland seer in the 1600s know that ships would one day sail past that particular hill? His second major prophecy is known as the Seaforth Doom. Before his execution, Kenneth predicted the end of the Seaforth Mackenzie line with extraordinary specificity. He said that the last chief would be both deaf and unable to speak clearly. This chief would father 4 sons, but all would die before him. He would have 4 daughters, each with a specific ailment. The estates and titles would pass through these daughters, but would ultimately end, scattered like leaves in the wind. The prophecy sat in the family records for over 150 years. Then, in the early 1800s, Francis Humbertston Mackenzie became chief of Seaforth. As a young man, he contracted scarlet fever, which left him severely deaf with an impaired speech. He had 4 sons. All 4 died before him. 1 drowned, 1 died of illness, 2 in military service overseas. He had 4 daughters. Historical records document that they suffered the exact ailments Kenneth had predicted. When Francis died in 1815, the Seaforth title and estates passed through his daughters and then fragmented just as prophesied. Every detail matched. The family certainly believed it. They'd preserved Kenneth's words for generations, watching with a mixture of dread and fascination as each element came true. Kenneth's third famous prophecy is called the Black Bridge Prediction. He said, "When there shall be a bridge over every stream, and a road over every hill, and a cow with a chain about her throat shall go in the place of a horse, the world shall go mad, and the clans be forgotten." This prophecy was recorded before 1700. By the 1800s, it was coming true in ways Kenneth's contemporaries could never have imagined. Railway viaducts, bridges were built over every Highland stream. Roads were constructed over every hill as Scotland modernized. And a cow with a chain about her throat in the place of a horse? This appears to describe railway locomotives, which replaced horses for transport and labor. More poignantly, the clans will be forgotten. This happened during the Highland clearances, when thousands of Highlanders were forced from their ancestral lands. The old clan system collapsed. The traditional Highland way of life ended. Kenneth Mackenzie saw all 3 centuries in advance. These prophecies were documented, dated, and verified. They weren't vague statements that could fit anything. They were specific, unusual, and accurate. So we're left with the question, how? Now, before we explore more cases, let's understand what second sight actually meant in Highland culture. The term is the two sights. It meant having normal vision plus the ability to see things that hadn't happened yet. Critically, this wasn't considered supernatural in Highland tradition. It was treated as a natural ability that some people had. Families noted it matter-of-factly. Young Donald has the sight, like his grandmother before him. It was recorded in family Bibles alongside births and marriages. It ran in families, passed down through generations, suggesting some hereditary component. The visions typically involved death. Most commonly, seers would see what they called taifs, apparitions of people who were about to die, often wrapped in shrouds. They might see tashka, visions of future events like battles or disasters. Sometimes they heard phantom sounds, funeral bells ringing for someone still alive, or the sound of a funeral procession passing on a road days before the actual funeral. The visions were almost always involuntary. Seers could summon them or control them when they came. Many found them distressing and prayed for the gift to be taken away. They often experienced physical warning signs, a sudden chill, a pressure in the head, a sense of dread, moments before a vision began. What made Highland second sight particularly notable was its specificity. These weren't vague feelings that something bad might happen. A seer might say, "I see Donald MacLeod falling from his horse at the old stone bridge on Tuesday," and on Tuesday it would happen exactly as described. They'd name people, places, circumstances, sometimes down to what clothing the person would be wearing. Highland chiefs took second sight seriously because it had practical applications. See, before going into battle, a chief might consult a clan member known to have the sight. And if the seer saw the chief's death, the battle might be avoided or postponed. If they saw victory, it could bolster the warrior's courage. This wasn't superstition to them. It was intelligence gathering from someone who could see further than ordinary eyes. Certain clan lines were particularly known for the sight. The Mackenzies produced many seers, which is why Kenneth O'Dara is the most famous. But the MacLeods of Skye, the MacDonalds, and the Frasers all had family lines noted for the ability. It was concentrated enough in certain families that it seemed clearly hereditary. The documentation is what makes this so intriguing to modern researchers. These weren't just oral traditions passed down. People wrote the visions when they occurred. Parish ministers kept records, families noted them in Bibles with dates. Clan historians documented them. We have some physical evidence of prophecies recorded before the events they predicted. And that's what makes this mystery so compelling. We can argue about whether the site was real or not, but we can't argue about the documentation. Something was happening in the Scottish Highlands that led to accurate predictions being recorded before the fact. The question is, what? Let's look at several specific cases from different Highland families, each documented in ways that have survived to this present day. In the family Bible of the MacLeods of Dunvegan, there's an entry dated March 15, 1732. It records that Anne MacLeod had a vision of her brother Donald falling from his horse at the old bridge near the estate. The entry is matter of fact. Anne saw Donald's fall, as she often sees things before they happen. 3 days later, on March 18th, Donald fell from his horse at the exact location Anne had described. And this book still exists, and both entries can be seen, the prophecy and the confirmation of its fulfillment. What's striking about this record is its casualness. There's no drama, no sense that something supernatural occurred. To the MacLeods of 1732, Anne's visions were simply a family trait, like red hair or a talent for music. The massacre at Glencoe in 1692 is one of the darkest moments in Highland history. Government soldiers, who had been guests of the MacDonald clan, turned on their hosts and slaughtered them in the early morning. What's less known is that several clan members reportedly had visions in the days before the attack. These visions were recorded later by clan historians in the 1720s. Multiple MacDonalds reported seeing soldiers with bloody hands, saw some men in red coats killing them in their homes. They told the clan chief, but he didn't take the warning seriously enough. How could soldiers who'd accepted Highland hospitality violate it so completely? On February 13th, 1692, exactly what the seers had described came to pass. Now, we have to be careful with this case. The written records came after the event, after the trauma. It's possible that the memory reshaped itself, that people convinced themselves after the fact that warning signs had been present. Trauma can do that. But the multiple witnesses and the specificity of the visions, red coats, bloody hands, early morning, are very intriguing. The night before the Battle of Culloden in 1746, a Fraser woman reportedly had a vision of the battlefield covered in dead Highlanders. She saw Prince Charles Edward Stuart fleeing. She described the devastating defeat in detail and told her clan chief that many would die if they fought. April 16th, 1746. The battle unfolded exactly as she described. The Highland army was destroyed. The prince fled. The clan system began its collapse. Family papers document this prophecy, though again written shortly after the event rather than before it. The historian's challenge here is determining whether this was truly precognition, or whether traumatized survivors needed to believe that some warning had been present. One of the most carefully documented cases comes from the journal of Reverend MacDonald of Skye, written in 1780s. The Reverend was a Presbyterian minister and a skeptic of second sight. He considered it superstition that the church needed to eradicate, but an incident changed his mind. A young woman in his parish came to him with a detailed description of a ship sinking. She named the ship, described where it would go down, and specified who would survive and who would drown. The Reverend, thinking this was foolishness, nonetheless wrote down everything she said, dated it and signed it. He wanted documentation in case she later tried to claim she'd predicted something after it had already happened. 3 weeks later, the ship sank. Every detail the woman had described came true. The location, the survivors, the victims. It all matched. In his journal, which still exists, the Reverend wrote, "I am compelled to record this most remarkable instance of what Highlanders call the second sight. I can offer no explanation, only the facts as they occurred." Here we have a skeptical witness, someone who wanted to disprove the phenomenon, instead becoming one of its most reliable documenters. In the 1820s, in a small village on the Isle of Lewis, multiple villagers reported seeing a phantom funeral procession for a man who was still alive and healthy. They saw the route the funeral would take, recognized specific mourners, even noted the weather conditions. It disturbed them enough that they wrote to the Inverness Courier newspaper about it, describing the vision in detail. 2 months later, the man died. His funeral followed the exact route the villagers had seen. The mourners matched. Even the weather. The newspaper documented both the original prediction and its fulfillment, making this one of the few cases with contemporary journalistic evidence. The last major documented case comes from the 1850s and involves the MacLeod family's legendary fairy flag, a sacred banner kept at Dunvegan Castle. Family tradition held that the flag could be unfurled 3 times in the clan's greatest need, and each time it would bring victory. But the tradition also warned that when it was unfurled for the 3rd time, the chief would die. The young chief in the 1850s scoffed at this superstition. His old nursemaid, who had the sight, saw his death in detail and begged him not to unfurl the flag. She described it exactly how he would die. He dismissed her concerns and raised the flag anyway. Within a short time, he died in exactly the circumstances she had foreseen. The flag has never been unfurled since. Looking across all these cases, certain patterns emerge. Most visions involve death. The sight seemed particularly attuned to mortality. The predictions were always specific. Concrete details about people, places, circumstances. Sometimes multiple people saw the same vision independently, which is harder to explain as individual hallucination or fantasy. The ability seemed to run in families, suggesting some biological component. And most intriguingly, the phenomena appeared to decline after the mid-1800s, as Highland culture itself was being destroyed by the clearances and forced modernization. So, what could explain all of this? Let's look at the main theories, both historical and modern. The first and most straightforward explanation is that it was real, that some people genuinely could see future events through mechanisms we don't understand. Supporters of this theory point to the specificity of the predictions, the documentation that exists from before events occurred, and the hereditary nature suggesting a biological basis. The challenge, of course, is that we have no scientific framework for how this could work. Our current understanding of physics doesn't allow for information to flow backward in time. Yet some evidence exists. The second theory suggests extreme intuition rather than supernatural foresight. Highland seers lived in close-knit communities where they knew everyone intimately. Perhaps they were extraordinarily gifted at reading subtle signs, noticing declining death, risk-taking behavior, dangerous patterns, social tensions. What looked like prophecy might have been the brain's subconscious, processing countless small observations, arriving at accurate predictions through pattern recognition, rather than actual foresight. Now this explains some of the cases quite well. A seer noticing that someone was becoming frail might predict their death. Someone observing dangerous conditions might foresee an accident, but this theory struggles with cases involving ships the seer had never seen, battles they were present at, or events that depended on highly specific circumstances that couldn't be predicted from available information. The third explanation involves coincidence and selection bias. Perhaps seers made predictions, but only the accurate ones were remembered and recorded. Failed prophecies were forgotten. Successful ones were preserved and possibly embellished over time. This definitely explains some of the oral tradition accounts where stories were passed down for generations before being written. But it struggles to explain cases where prophecies were documented in writing before events occurred. Kenneth Mackenzie's prophecies in parish records decades before their fulfillment. The Reverend's journal entry signed and dated before the ship sank. Selection bias can't account for dated documentation. Modern neurology offers an interesting angle. Temporal lobe epilepsy can cause intense visions and sometimes create a feeling that you're seeing the future. The condition can be hereditary, which would explain why second sight ran in families. This could account for the physical sensations seers described, the warning signs they felt before visions began. However, this doesn't explain why the visions would be accurate. A seizure might create the experience of seeing the future, but why would those visions actually predict real events? Unless we propose that somehow the neurological condition occasionally allows for genuine precognition, this theory only explains the experience of having visions, not their accuracy. Some researchers suggest cultural conditioning. If you grow up in a community that believes in second sight and you're told from childhood that certain family members have this gift, you might interpret ordinary anxiety or vivid dreams as prophetic visions. When something you worried about actually happens, it confirms this belief. The community's expectations shape your experience. This explains the cultural specificity. Why second sight was such a distinctly Highland phenomenon. But it doesn't explain seers who didn't want the gift and prayed for it to stop. It doesn't account for the children who had visions before understanding the cultural context. And again, it struggles with the documented accuracy of specific predictions. More recently, a few physicists have proposed truly speculative theories involving quantum mechanics and consciousness. Some interpretations of quantum physics suggest that observation affects reality in ways that we don't fully understand yet. A few researchers have proposed that consciousness might not be entirely bound by linear time. That in some circumstances, we might be able to remember future events as easily as we remember the past. Now, this is highly speculative and has no experimental support. But interestingly, Highland seers were accessing something like this. If they were accessing anything at all, long before quantum physics existed as a concept. Were they tapping into some aspect of reality that our science is only now beginning to theorize about? The honest answer is that we don't know. Some cases can be explained by coincidence, pattern recognition, or cultural factors. But others, particularly those with data documentation, multiple witnesses and extraordinary specificity, remain genuinely mysterious. The Highland clans believed absolutely in second sight because they experienced it, documented it, and relied on it for practical decisions. Something was happening. What exactly? The question remains unanswered. The Presbyterian Church's attitude towards second sight adds another fascinating dimension to this story. After the Scottish Reformation in the 1560s, the Kirk, as the Church of Scotland is known, launched a sustained campaign against what it considered superstitious practices. Second sight was seen as witchcraft, or at best, commerce with the devil. Ministers preached against it. Seers were called before kirk sessions, church courts, and forced to repent publicly. Some were excommunicated. The church was particularly adamant because second sight was so widespread in the Highlands that it threatened the Kirk's authority. How could ministers claim sole access to God's will when ordinary clan members could see the future? Here's the paradox. Most Highland seers were devout Christians who attended church regularly, said their prayers and lived pious lives. They didn't seek their visions and often prayed for the gift to be taken away. They saw it as a burden that God had given them, not something that they had chosen. The involuntary nature of the visions made the church's accusations of deliberate witchcraft seem particularly cruel. Kirk session records from the 1680s document the case of a woman brought before church elders and accused of exercising the second sight. Now, when asked if she'd renounced this practice, she replied simply, "I cannot help what I see. I do not seek these visions, and I would be grateful if they stopped. But they come, whether I will them or not." She was forced to repent publicly anyway and warned that continued visions would result in excommunication. Yet according to family records, her visions continued. She simply stopped talking about them openly. The same pattern repeated across the Highlands. The church could force public recantations, but it couldn't actually stop the visions or change people's beliefs. The church's campaign was part of a larger effort to suppress Gaelic Highland culture. After the Jacobite risings, particularly after the defeated Culloden, there was a systematic attempt to destroy the Highland way of life. Speaking Gaelic was discouraged. Wearing tartan was banned for decades. The clan system was dismantled, and beliefs like second sight were attacked as primitive superstition. Yet the belief persisted. Even after the clearances, when Highlanders were scattered across the world, those who emigrated to Canada, Australia, and America carried the tradition with them. Accounts of second sight appear in Nova Scotian and Cape Breton records from Highland immigrant communities well into the 1800s. The last widely documented case within Scotland occurred in 1930s on the Isle of Skye. An elderly woman, descended from a known line of seers, reported a vision of a fishing boat sinking with all hands. She named the boat and the date. The boat went down exactly as she foreseen. By then, the second sight was treated as a curious historical footnote, rather than an active part of Highland life. But it hadn't completely disappeared. It had just gone quiet. So, what happened to the second sight? In the 1960s and 70s, during a period when parapsychology was taken more seriously by academic institutions, researchers sought out Highland families known to have produced seers. They wanted to test whether any remnant of the ability remained. They found descendants of famous seers. The results were inconclusive, but intriguing. In controlled studies, some subjects showed small statistical anomalies in prediction tasks, not dramatic, but slightly above what chance would suggest. Some reported vivid dreams that occasionally came, though nothing like the specific detailed visions of their ancestors. Many said they had strong intuitions that usually proved accurate. Others reported nothing unusual at all. What researchers couldn't determine was whether any genuine precognitive ability existed in these families, or whether they were simply dealing with a normal range of coincidence and intuition that anyone might experience. The dramatic, specific visions that filled historical records had vanished. The disappearance itself is part of the mystery. If second sight was purely cultural conditioning or superstition, we'd expect it to fade as Highland culture suppressed, which it did. But if it was a genuine biological ability, why would it disappear? Genetic traits don't vanish in just a few generations. One possibility is that the ability still exists, but people no longer recognize it for what it is. In a culture that believed in second sight and valued it, someone having a precognitive vision would understand what was happening and know how to record it. In modern skeptical culture, the same person might dismiss the experience as just a weird dream, probably my imagination, and never mention it again. Another possibility is that the modern world itself inhibits the phenomenon. Highlander seers lived in quiet, isolated communities with strong connections to the natural world. They spent long hours in contemplation, walking the hills, attending to the rhythms of weather and the season. Modern life, with its constant noise and stimulation, might drown out whatever subtle perception allowed second sight to function. Perhaps second sight hasn't disappeared. Perhaps it's just gone into hiding, surviving in private experiences that people no longer share openly, no longer write in family Bibles, no longer treat as valuable information. The Highland culture that supported and documented the phenomenon has largely vanished, but the human beings who might carry the same perceptual abilities still exist. The truth, like so many historical mysteries, probably lies somewhere in the middle ground. Scottish Highlands taught generations that reality might be larger, stranger, more layered than the everyday world suggests. The visions could arrive uninvited. That time might bend. That some knowledge comes from sources we cannot name or explain. Whether any of that was true in a literal sense, it created a rich, complex culture that treated mystery with respect and left room for wonder. And perhaps that's a gift worth remembering, even if we can never verify the gifts of second sight itself. The Irish Druids trained for 20 years, memorizing vast bodies of learning. They studied astronomy, law, medicine, natural history, philosophy. Roman observers called them the intellectual equals of Greek philosophers. Irish kings deferred to their judgment, yet they never wrote any of it down. It was forbidden to record their sacred knowledge. When Christianity arrived in Ireland and the Druidic tradition died out, all that knowledge vanished. 20 years of education accumulated over centuries, preserved in human memory alone. Tonight, we'll piece together what the Romans witnessed, what early Irish manuscripts reveal, what archaeology suggests, and contemplate what we lost forever when the last Druid died without passing on their learning. Let us begin with what the Romans saw. In 56 BC, Julius Caesar led his legions into Gaul, what we now call France, and encountered a society dominated by a learned class called Druids. Caesar was a careful observer, and what he saw impressed him enough to write about it in detail. According to Caesar's accounts, Druids underwent training that lasted as much as 20 years. Think about that. 20 years of full-time education, all of it done through memorization. Everything was committed to memory and recited until perfect. Why no writing? Caesar explained that the Druids believed knowledge loses its power and sanctity when written down. They also feared their sacred learning falling into the wrong hands. If everything existed only in trained minds, it could carefully be controlled, passed only to those who deemed worthy after years of proving themselves. Caesar noted that some students travelled specifically to Britain and Ireland for their Druidic education. This is significant. It suggests Ireland, unconquered by Rome, was recognized as a center of Druidic learning, perhaps the most important center. When Roman persecution drove Druids from Gaul, many fled to Ireland, concentrating the tradition there. So what did they actually study during those 20 years? Caesar listed several subjects: the movements of the stars and their meaning, the size of the earth and the universe, the nature of the physical world and what he called the power and majesty of the immortal gods. This wasn't superstition. Caesar, an educated Roman, recognized it as systematic learning comparable to Greek natural philosophy. But Druids were more than scholars. They were judges who settled all legal disputes, from property boundaries to compensation for injuries. They advised kings on matters of war and peace. They taught the children of nobility. They preserved genealogies and historical records. They led religious ceremonies and interpreted omens. Most remarkably, they held authority over kings. In council meetings, the king could not speak until the Druid had spoken first. Druids could excommunicate people from religious rites, essentially a social death sentence. Their legal judgments were final and binding. They were exempt from military service and didn't pay taxes. This wasn't a marginal group in society. The Druids were the intellectual and legal elite of the Celtic world. Another Roman, Pliny the Elder, writing in 77 AD, added more details. He described their knowledge of plants and healing. He witnessed their ceremony of cutting mistletoe with golden sickles. It was not superstitious theater, but a carefully timed harvest of a plant they used medicinally. He noted their understanding of astronomy, how they calculated the precise timing for their ceremonies based on celestial movements. What strikes us reading these Roman accounts is the consistency. Multiple independent observers, often hostile to Celtic culture, all confirm the same basic facts. Druids underwent decades of training, memorized enormous bodies of knowledge, and wielded authority based on their learning. These weren't primitive shamans or simple priests. They were a highly educated class whose knowledge was systematic and sophisticated enough to impress even Roman observers familiar with Greek philosophy and Roman law. The question is, if they spent 20 years memorizing, what exactly was in those minds? The Romans never conquered Ireland, which means the Druidic tradition survived there longer than anywhere else. When Christianity arrived in Ireland around 432 AD with St. Patrick and other missionaries, something interesting happened. Rather than completely destroying the old culture, Christian monks in Ireland did something very unusual. They wrote down significant portions of it. Between 600 and 800 AD, Irish monasteries produced manuscripts preserving ancient Irish laws, genealogies, histories, and epic tales. These weren't Christian creations, they were pre-Christian knowledge being recorded for the first time. And they give us our best window into what Druids called the Dree in Irish. Let's start with the Brehon. The Brehon laws are the ancient legal codes, written down by monks but clearly pre-Christian in origin. They're extraordinarily sophisticated. We're talking about a legal system that covered property rights, injury compensation, contracts, environmental protection, and women's rights with a level of detail and nuance that wouldn't be matched in most of Europe for centuries later. For example, the Brehon laws had precise compensation amounts for every conceivable type of injury or insult. Lost a tooth, specific compensation. Scar on the face, different amount depending on visibility. Each person had an honor price based on their social status, and crimes were compensated accordingly. This required memorizing thousands of specific cases, precedents, and amounts. The laws also protected trees. Sacred trees couldn't be cut without severe penalty. Even non-sacred trees had protections based on their usefulness. Cut down an oak that marked a territorial boundary. That carried one punishment. Cut down an apple tree that fed a community. Different punishment. The Druids who administered these laws had to know every tree species, its uses, its social and practical value. Women's rights under the Brehon law were remarkably advanced. Women could own property independently, divorce their husbands for specific reasons, practice professions, and had legal protections during pregnancy. A husband couldn't make major decisions without his wife's consent. This wasn't primitive tribal law. This was a sophisticated legal framework that someone had to learn, memorize, and apply. The Irish bardic tradition gives us another clue about Druidic knowledge. After the Druids disappeared, the roles were partly continued by the Fairies, poets and historians. To become a qualified Fairy required 12 years of training, down from the Druidic 20. During this time, they had to memorize at least 250 long poems and stories, plus all major genealogies, historical events, and territorial boundaries. If the shortened successor tradition required memorizing 250 major works, what did the full Druidic training include? Modern scholars estimate that a 20-year Druidic education might have included the equivalent of 10,000 pages of material, legal codes, astronomical calculations, medicinal formulas, historical accounts, and ritual knowledge. The medical knowledge is particularly intriguing. Irish medical families in the medieval period preserved some Druidic healing knowledge, and their manuscripts from the 1300s and 1400s reference old knowledge and ancient techniques. They show sophisticated understanding of herbs, successful surgical procedures including skull surgery, and herbal combinations that modern research has found genuinely effective. Archaeological evidence backs this up. We found Iron Age Irish skulls with successful trepanation, holes drilled in the skull that healed, meaning that the patient survived. This wasn't butchery. This was skilled surgery. Someone had to know precisely where to drill, how deep to go, how to prevent infection, how to manage pain. That knowledge came from somewhere. The astronomical knowledge is perhaps most impressive. Major Irish sites like Newgrange show that 5,200 years ago, 3,000 years before the Druids, people in Ireland were calculating the celestial movements with extraordinary precision. Newgrange's passage aligns perfectly with the winter solstice sunrise. The Hill of Tara has multiple astronomical alignments. Druids inherited and maintained this ancient knowledge, adding their own observations over centuries. The Irish calendar system preserved in medieval text shows this sophistication. It tracked both solar and lunar cycles, aligning major festivals with precise solar events. This required detailed astronomical observation and mathematical calculation. Then there was the epic tales, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, the Cattle Raid of Cooley, and the other Irish epics that were preserved orally by Druids before being written down. They contain references to Druidic practices, controlling weather, prophesizing future events, interpreting dreams, and understanding what the Irish called thin places. Locations where the boundary between the physical and spiritual worlds grew thin. How much of this is embellishment? It's hard to say. but the consistent detail suggests these stories preserve real cultural practices, even if the supernatural elements were exaggerated over generations of retelling. The lives of Irish saints, written by monks, provide another perspective. St. Patrick supposedly debated Druids on theological matters. These accounts describe Druids as educated opponents who could predict eclipses, interpret natural phenomena, understand the properties of plants that could heal or harm. The competitive tone of these stories suggests the Christian writers saw Druids as genuine rivals, not simple primitives. All of this evidence points to the same conclusion, that Druids preserved and transmitted enormous bodies of systematic knowledge. They were lawyers, they were historians, astronomers, physicians, philosophers, and priests, all combined into one. And it seemed to be all in their heads. While written sources tell us what Druids knew, archaeology shows us the physical evidence of their knowledge in action. The astronomical sites are most dramatic. Newgrange wasn't built by Druids, it's far older, but it proves that astronomical knowledge in Ireland goes back over 5 millennia. The structure is older than the pyramids itself, and its winter solstice alignment is so precise that modern engineers marvel at it. The builders knew exactly where the sun would rise on the shortest day of the year, and constructed a passage that channels the specific beam of light into the central chamber. Druids inherited this tradition of celestial observation. The Hill of Tara, Ireland's ancient royal seat, has multiple astronomical alignments. Stone circles across Ireland orient to various celestial events. This wasn't accidental. It required centuries of careful observation, mathematical calculation, and transmitted knowledge. The Druids were the last keepers of an astronomical tradition stretching back to Ireland's Neolithic period. Medical evidence from burial sites reveals sophisticated intervention. We find healed fractures that were clearly set by someone who understood bone structure. Trepan skulls where the patient survived show surgical knowledge. Some burial sites include herbs that we now know have genuine medicinal properties. The physical evidence validates the textual claims about Druidic medical knowledge. The metalwork is another clue. Bronze and Iron Age Irish metalwork shows extraordinary technical skill. Geometric patterns, complex alloys, techniques that required mathematical understanding. The Broy hoard, dating from the 1st century BC, includes a gold boat with such fine detail that modern jewelers struggle to understand how it was made. Did Druids teach craft knowledge, or at least preserve the mathematical and geometrical principles behind it? But here's what's most striking about the archaeological record. What's missing? There are no Druidic texts anywhere, not in Ireland, not in Britain, not in Gaul. No libraries, no archives, no carved inscriptions of their teachings. Despite Celtic cultures having contact with literate civilizations and despite knowing how to write, they used ogham inscriptions and Greek letters for trade. They never recorded their sacred knowledge. The absence is itself evidence. It proves they didn't write it down. 20 years of education existed only in memory. If we estimate that a dedicated student could memorize the equivalent of several hundred pages per year, 20 years could theoretically contain the equivalent of thousands of pages of knowledge. The human memory, properly trained, is capable of extraordinary feats. But when that tradition breaks, when no new students are trained, when the last teachers die, everything vanishes. No library to consult, no backup copies, just gone. Based on all our evidence, we can reconstruct the likely categories of Druidic knowledge, even if we can't recover the specific details. Legal knowledge was clearly extensive. The Brehon laws prove this. Every type of contract, every form of injury. Druids carried the equivalent in their minds. They could hear a case, recall relevant precedents, cite specific legal amounts, and render binding judgments, all from memory. The laws were living knowledge, interpreted and applied flexibly to specific circumstances while maintaining consistency with tradition. Astronomical knowledge was equally sophisticated. They tracked the solar year precisely for agricultural timing. They calculated lunar cycles for their calendar and probably for predicting tides. They knew star positions and movements, possibly even eclipse prediction. Several accounts mention this. They aligned sacred sites with celestial events and knew exactly when to plant, when to harvest, when to hold ceremonies. Some scholars suggest they had a zodiac-like system, though evidence for this is limited. Medical and natural history knowledge was vast. They needed to know every plant, its properties, which healed, which poisoned, which altered consciousness. They knew seasonal timing for gathering, since many plants are only effective at certain times. They understood preparation methods: raw, boiled, fermented, aged, and, crucially, dosages. Many medicinal plants are poisonous in large amounts, but healing in small doses. Get this wrong could kill patients. They also knew surgical techniques, bone setting, wound treatment, and possibly early antiseptic methods using bulk plants. They remembered major events, battles, alliances, betrayals. They knew territorial boundaries and the historical basis for land rights. They preserved treaties and agreements. Without writing, the Druid was the historical record. Later, Irish bards memorized over 300 years of genealogies. Druids likely maintained even deeper historical knowledge. Religious and spiritual knowledge is the hardest to reconstruct, since Christian monks didn't preserve pagan theologies. The Druids clearly knew the nature and relationships of various gods and spirits. Proper ritual practices, the sacred calendar's significance, divination techniques, interpretations of omens and dreams and beliefs about the afterlife. The Celts believed in reincarnation, which suggests a more complex theology than simple nature worship. Language and poetic knowledge was central. They may have invented the Ogham alphabet, a unique Irish writing system that appears around the time the Druids were active. They knew complex poetic meters, the power of satire, which had legal weight in Irish society, incantations and prayers, and the deep meaning of place names. Some scholars suggest they maintained a sacred language distinct from common speech. What we can only guess at includes philosophy. The Romans said Druids debated natural philosophy, suggesting systematic thinking about nature's reality. They must have known mathematics, necessary for astronomy and architecture. They apparently understood human psychology well enough to interpret dreams and counsel kings. Several accounts mention weather prediction. There's likely more we can't even imagine. Categories of knowledge that made sense in their worldview, but that we lack the framework to understand. But why was any of this never written down? The question haunts us. They weren't ignorant of writing. Celts used Greek letters for trade and commerce. The Ogham alphabet existed. They could have created books, scrolls, inscribed stones with their laws and learning. So why didn't they? The answer lies in their beliefs about the true nature of knowledge itself. To Druids, spoken knowledge was living knowledge. It carried power, authority, and sacred force. The act of teaching was relationship. The Druid's presence, voice, and person gave the knowledge legitimacy and life. Written words were dead, frozen, emptied of their vital force. There was also a practical security concern. Knowledge in books could be stolen, copied, misinterpreted, or misused by the unworthy. But knowledge held in memory, passed only after years of proving oneself trustworthy, remained controlled. You couldn't steal what existed only in a teacher's mind, unless you underwent the full training to receive it properly. The training of memory was itself considered a spiritual practice. Developing the capacity to hold 20 years of learning transformed the student. The discipline required, the mental structures built, the deep internalization of knowledge. These weren't just about information transfer. They were about creating a particular kind of person. Someone whose mind itself was a sacred vessel. The teacher-student relationship was central. Knowledge wasn't just transmitted, but explained, contextualized, tested. The teacher could assess whether the student truly understood, whether they were ready for more dangerous or powerful knowledge, whether they could be trusted with it. This personal transmission ensured proper use and prevented abuse. But the consequence of this system was catastrophic. Of course, when the Druids died out and the chain of transmission broke, everything vanished. There was no library to raid, no archive to discover. No stone inscriptions to translate, just silence. Just the scattered, often hostile accounts of outsiders who observed Druidic practices without understanding their full depth. It may be the single greatest knowledge loss in European history. The disappearance happened gradually over several centuries. First, the Romans conquered Gaul and the Druids were suppressed. The Roman government saw them as potential leaders of resistance and systematically undermined their authority. Many fled to Britain and Ireland when Rome never conquered. Knowledge that had been spread across Celtic Europe concentrated in these last refuges. Then Christianity arrived in Ireland around 432 AD. This wasn't primarily a violent conversion. St. Patrick and other missionaries offered something compelling: connection to the wider Christian world, access to Latin learning, and most crucially, writing. Christian monasteries became new centers of education, offering young people an alternative to lengthy Druidic training. The transition was probably gradual. For a generation or two, both systems coexisted. But Christian schools had advantages. They could offer fast education through books. They connected students to roaming learning and the broader Christian world. They promised spiritual salvation through a new religion that was spreading across Europe. As young people increasingly chose Christian education, Druidic schools had fewer students. Within a few generations, the unbroken chain of master teaching apprentice began to break. Some Druidic knowledge was preserved. The monks wrote down laws, histories, because these were practically useful. Medical knowledge was preserved because healing the sick was Christian charity. Epic tales were recorded because they had cultural value. But the preservation was selective and filtered. Pagan religious practices weren't preserved. They directly competed with Christianity. Divination methods were condemned as demonic. Magic of any kind was suppressed. Philosophical and astronomical knowledge that contradicted Christian cosmology was ignored or dismissed. What got written down was what the Christian monks considered valuable, or at least harmless. What was deliberately lost was enormous. The entire Druidic theology, their understanding of nature's divine aspects, their methods of prophecy and divination, their astronomical knowledge, perhaps most of their philosophical speculation about reality's nature. Anything that competed with Christian authority or doctrine simply wasn't preserved. References to active Druids continue in Irish sources until the 600s and 700s AD. They gradually merged with the bardic tradition, losing their religious authority and legal power, but maintaining some role as poets and historians. By 900 AD, the tradition was essentially extinct. The memory of the Druids remained. They appear in tales and legends, but the knowledge is gone. The last Druid probably died without fanfare, perhaps not even realizing they were the last. Just an elderly person whose students had all chosen Christian education, taking 20 years of learning to the grave. And with them went answers to questions we now desperately want to ask. Modern scholars and even amateur enthusiasts have tried various approaches to recover some fragments of what was lost. Archaeological excavation of Druid-associated sites continues. Ritual deposits in bogs and lakes reveal what offerings were made, possibly suggesting beliefs and practices. Chemical analysis of ancient remains can detect plant use, potentially identifying medicinal herbs. Studying astronomical alignments at ancient sites reveals what celestial events may have been considered significant. But archaeology can only tell us so much. It shows us the physical traces but can't recover thoughts, words, explanations. Comparative studies look at other oral traditions, particularly the Vedic tradition in India, which preserved enormous bodies of knowledge through oral transmission for thousands of years. These studies show that human memory, properly trained, can preserve vast amounts of information accurately across generations. This validates the possibility that Druids really did maintain the knowledge scope ancient sources claim. Analysis of Celtic languages, particularly Old Irish, has revealed some pre-Christian terminology embedded. Some words preserve concepts or practices. Place names contain Druidic geography. Modern Druidic movements have existed since the 1700s, but most practitioners acknowledge they're reconstructing or reimagining rather than continuing an unbroken tradition. The chain broke too long ago. What exists now is inspiration, drawn from scattered sources, not recovered ancient knowledge. Some practitioners focus on nature spirituality and environmental wisdom, which may echo Druidic values even if specific practices are invented. So, what have we learned about what Irish Druids actually knew? We know they underwent 20 years of intensive oral education. We know they studied astronomy, law, medicine, natural history, philosophy. We know they held authority over kings, settled disputes, advised on matters of war and peace. Irish manuscripts preserve fragments of their historical knowledge, but the whole of it, the integrated understanding that took 2 decades to master, the philosophical framework that made sense of all these different types of knowledge, the religious and spiritual teachings that gave meaning to their role, that's all lost. We live in an age where we preserve everything. Every piece of information is digitized, backed up, redundant. We can access the world's knowledge from our pockets. Yet we've lost knowledge that once existed only in human minds. The Druids believed that memory was more reliable than text, that living knowledge in living minds was sacred and powerful in ways that written words could never be. Text can burn, degrade, be deliberately destroyed. The Library of Alexandria burned. Medieval manuscripts crumbled. Wars have destroyed countless archives. But but a living tradition, when it breaks, can never be recovered. Perhaps the real mystery isn't what they knew, but what we lost when we stopped valuing knowledge held in memory. Somewhere in ancient Ireland, in oak groves now gone, beside sacred wells now forgotten, Druids taught their students. They preserved knowledge for centuries without writing a word. And that died with them. We'll never know exactly what they knew. We can piece together fragments, make educated guesses, verify bits and pieces, but the whole of it, the integrated wisdom of Druidic tradition, is lost forever. The last Druid took those secrets to the grave, and the oak groves they walked are silent now.